Welcome to another .NET user group with a focus on Blazor from sunny Bournemouth in Dorset, part of the .NET Foundation. Well, it's great that you've been able to join us yet again for another presentation around Azure, .NET and Blazor. So, what have we got in store for you today? Our guest speaker today is Chris Sainty, who will be talking about Blazor routing in detail. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our community sponsor Syncfusion for their community license of their Blazor components and also for their support for our group, enabling us to give away swag and other goodies. Well, we're certainly looking forward to this one. Let's dive right in. Evening, Alex. Nice to see you.
Hello, Carl. How you doing?
Yeah, not bad.
Good, excellent.
Warm enough for you?
Just a bit.
Hi, Andrew. Nice to see you again. Welcome, Mike. Hi, Ian. Nice to see you.
Hello, Carl. How are you?
Pretty good. Nice
Good.
and warm.
Yeah, it is a bit, isn't it?
Not as warm as Chris, I don't think, but
Is this going to get recorded? Because I may have a problem watching all of this.
yeah, that is the plan. We've got it on record, and we'll do a bit of post editing. And
Have you watched Blazor Train yet? To see?
I have indeed.
Chris?
I've seen Chris on there as well.
Yeah.
With the modal dialogues, and yeah, it's really good, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Really entertaining and.
Yeah.
There's a lot of waffling. I watched it back the other day and I was like, oh my word, I've waffled a lot. That was Carl's a great guy, but he springs stuff on you. So like I recorded that with him about an hour and a half after he asked me to do it.
Right.
Brilliant.
So it's just like, yeah, would you be interested to talk about your modal? Yeah. So can you record it in an hour?
Fair play for you for signing up for it. It was really entertaining, actually, really good, because he had his slant as well, didn't he, on certain things, and I thought it went, yeah, good marrying up. So just for info, I will be forcing a mute of everyone's microphones just before Chris makes a start. But we would really like to encourage you to raise questions over the chat. And Chris has indicated he's really happy to digress and for us to take a few questions during the presentation. But then at the end, we'll unmute everyone and we can kind of get back to having a kind of round up and a chat. And if you'd like to use your microphone then please feel free. How's it going there, George?
Yeah, well, I think there's still a couple still trickling in slowly, but yeah, I think that's all good. Ready to start when you are.
Hey, lovely. Well, welcome everyone on this rather warm evening. Appreciate your attendance, and I know Chris does as well. We're really grateful to have Chris this evening to discuss yet another really interesting Blazor topic, that of Blazor routing. And I think, as we've said previously, as soon as you start developing a Blazor application, whether it be WebAssembly or Blazor server in earnest, routing is a thing that certainly starts to surface as a thing that you want to really get a good handle on, particularly as your the complexity of your application grows. The format for this evening will be obviously the talk from Chris. We've been really in eager anticipation for this. It's taken us a few weeks to get hold of him, so we appreciate this time that he can spend with us this evening. We've also got some giveaways to pass on to you, courtesy of the support that we've achieved from Syncfusion, who are currently supporting our community efforts, and there's some Amazon gift cards up for grabs for you there, and George will be handling the what we call the Wheel of Doom for you a bit later on. We've also got some stickers to pass on to one lucky member this evening. We're actually looking to give away the Windows versions. These are actually won by myself on Jeff Fritz's show. There was some kind of questions that were popping up, and I think on that occasion you weren't actually there answering most of the questions, Chris. So I managed to poke in an answer there, and as a result, Jeff sent some stickers for us for the Windows version, and I think we'd like to donate the Mac version of the stickers to you actually tonight, Chris, because I don't think you've got any of those for your Mac. So if you'd like, we'll pass those on to you at the end as a little token of appreciation for this evening.
Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. So without further ado, we would like to hand the stage over to Chris as we discuss Blazor routing. Chris, I'll share screen with you now.
Cool, lovely, thank you. Cool evening, everybody. As Carl said, I do appreciate you turning up tonight because it is sweltering, and you are going to probably watch me melt during the process of this talk. My head's getting shinier and shinier as things go on. So let me just share my screen, and then we'll get going. So I'm going to share that one. Let me just move some windows about. Cool. That can go away, and let me just start this up. Cool. Is everybody seeing that? Okay.
Perfect.
When you see me look over here, I'm looking at a different monitor. I'm not just randomly looking out the window. Cool. So I'm going to be talking to you about routing in Blazor. Routing in Blazor is kind of an interesting topic because there's some things that I think people get tripped on fairly regularly, but I think compared to other SPA frameworks, routing in Blazor is relatively simplistic at the moment. I will warn you now, the start of this talk is very basic. We cover some real fundamentals of simple HTML pages. So I do apologize, but it does ramp up pretty quick. And by the end, we're talking about some fairly advanced bits and bobs. So yeah, so let me just whiz through this stuff. So the first bit, I just want to set the scene really and just highlight the differences between navigation in traditional web apps and Blazor applications. So traditional web apps, we're going to type in an address in a browser, we're going to go off to a server, and then the server is going to send us back whatever the page is that we've requested, and then our browser is going to render that page for us. That's quite straightforward. And then once we've got that initial page, then we're going to move around that application by clicking on various links. So for example, here, we're going to click on this view details link. And just like before, we're going to go off to the server, and then it's going to return us a new page. So item 2, for example, and then our browser will render that page. So pretty basic stuff. I mean, the fundamental thing to understand here is that essentially we've moved between 2 physical pages. It's probably a bad way to put it. They probably in most server-based frameworks, they're probably not physical pages. So MVC Razor pages, there's going to be some kind of server-side generation along the way. But for all intents and purposes, we're talking about totally independent pages. And we're refreshing the whole thing every time. So how does that compare to Blazor? Well, Blazor applications start up in a similar way. We type in an address, we go off to the server, and then again, the server is going to return us a page, and our browser is going to render that page for us. Pretty much exactly the same so far. So when we start moving around in the application, things become very different. So I'm going to illustrate this by talking about it specifically in how Blazor WebAssembly works, because how Blazor server works can be a bit confusing if with the traditional model. So, and I'll explain that in a second. So here we are with our Blazor WebAssembly app. We're going to click on a link here. And this time, we're not going to go back to the server. What's going to happen now is that this navigation event is going to get intercepted by a component. It's the router component that's in Blazor. And what the router component is going to do is it's going to look at what we've requested, what route we've requested. So in this link, it's this /item/2 link. And then it's going to check an in-memory table that it generates when your application boots up. So this is a routing table. And essentially, it's got two key pieces of information here. It's got a list of routes, and then it's got a list of components that handle those routes. So in this particular instance, it's going to match with this second one here. The route here has got this weird syntax, this squiggly brackets with an ID, and that's something called a route parameter. I'm going to talk about those a little bit later on. So if you're not familiar with those, don't worry, we'll cover those in a bit. But take my word for it right now, that's the route that will match. And what's going to happen now is the router is going to load this item details component. Once it loads that component, then it's going to trigger a re-render, and Blazor is going to compare the current render, so this Contuso store page we're looking at, with the item details component. It's going to work out what the minimum changes are that need to be applied to the DOM to make it look like the item details page. And then it's going to apply those updates, and then the page is going to auto-magically transform in front of us. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed as well, the address bar has changed. It now has contusostore.com/item/2. That all happens. This was a real browser. The forward and back buttons would still be working. So you'd still have this complete feel of a genuine move between real pages. But in fact, all that's happened is that chunks of HTML have been swapped out for other chunks of HTML to give it the illusion that the page has changed, and some stuff's happened with some browser APIs to make those forward and back buttons work. And we'll look at those in detail in a little bit. So let's just talk quickly about a Blazor server application. And I'm going to explain this, and you'll probably see why I did the WebAssembly one first. So we're in the same scenario. We've loaded that initial page for the Blazor server app, and now we're going to click on a link. And this time around, instead of happening in the browser, what's going to happen is that navigation event is going to get transmitted over Signal R over to the router that's running on the application on the server. And this is why I didn't do this one first, because you can see it looks, can be confused with the traditional web app model of going back to the server and coming back again. But once we're on the server, stuff continues as it did before. So we check that routing table, we find a match, and then the same thing happens. We process those UI updates. Those UI updates get sent back over that Signal R connection back down to the browser. And again, that little Blazor runtime that runs in the browser is then going to update it and make it look like that other page. So essentially the same stuff, it's just getting stretched out over that Signal R connection. No differences really. So that's a real high level of how routing works in Blazor. So let's start delving into stuff now. So we're going to start talking about the router component. It's the brains of the outfit. It's where all the magic happens, as it were. So the router component looks like this. You can find the router component in the app component in a default Blazor app. So there's a few key pieces of information that are worth knowing about the router. So first of all, it takes a parameter called AppAssembly. And what we do here is we pass an assembly that we want it to scan to look for page components. So what are page components? Well, you've probably heard of them under a different name if you looked at the Blazor docs. The guys at Microsoft decided that officially page components would actually be called routable components, which is very Microsoft naming. It's very literal. You do route to them indeed, but I think anybody else would always refer to a page as a page. Ironically enough, the directive that we use to create a routable component is called page. I don't know why they then decided routable was a good name, but anyway, they did. For the rest of this talk from now on, whenever you hear page components, if you've heard routable components, then please swap the terms around. But I will use page components because I think it's clearer. So essentially, we're going to scan that assembly and we're going to find any of these page components. As I mentioned a second ago, that's any normal component that has this page directive in it. And I'll show you that in a bit more detail in a second as well. So that's the AppAssembly parameter. The next part is this found template. So as you can probably guess, this is where it's going to render any page components that are found from that routing table. But actually, it's not the router that renders them. It's actually another component called the route view component. So you can see that in the middle of that highlighted section there. What happens is some information about the component that needs to be rendered, which is gathered by the router from that routing table. That's passed to the route view via that route data parameter. Okay, you can see that being passed down in the middle there. And that contains the type of the component that needs to be displayed. It also will contain any other information about that component. For example, if it has any parameters and the values for those parameters, so that they can all be passed into that component so that it can all be run and fired up correctly. The other thing with the root view is it allows us to specify a default layout. Now, default layouts are quite useful. We can specify a default layout at this level, and that will affect the entire application. Well, this is handy because now we can set our layout for our application in one place, and every single page in our application will inherit that same layout. Now, if anybody is new to the .NET, ASP.NET world and isn't sure what layouts are, you can think of layouts as a way of abstracting the common UI features. So things like header bars, footer bars, navigation menus. You can put all of these in a common file called a layout, and then it has a special parameter. It's a bit like a token you can put on a certain place on the page, and then whenever a page gets loaded into that layout, it will get rendered wherever that little token is. So like I say, it's a good way of not duplicating loads of common UI. So yeah, so that's a really useful thing to be able to specify this at the top level. However, you might have scenarios where certain pages need different layouts. Well, that's not a problem. You can also specify layouts on the individual page components themselves, and they will override whatever you pick for a default layout. So you can still set a default layout, and then for the, if you have a certain section that needs a different layout, you can just specify that in those particular pages. And then the next section is the not found template. And again, you can probably guess what this is. This is what's rendered when it can't find a match for a route in that routing table. So by default, it's configured using a layout view component. And a layout view component does one thing and one thing only. It allows you to specify a layout for the content to render in. So in this instance, this little, sorry, there's nothing in this address message will get rendered into this main layout that's specified using the layout parameter there. You can put whatever you want in there though. So you don't actually have to have raw HTML in there. You could put another component in there, for example. So if you had a component that you wanted that had a certain look and feel that was for not found, then you could put that in there. You could put more HTML markup. It doesn't need to be single line. Basically, whatever you put in there will get rendered as if it were a page, really. So you can customize that to your heart's content. So that's the kind of key parts that make up the router. But how does the router actually discover page components? So I mentioned a second ago that page components are defined by using the page directive. And you can see it in this little code snippet here. So the page directive has kind of two parts. It's the directive declaration itself, which is this at page. And then the second half is something called a route template. And the route template is telling the router the route that this particular component is going to be responsible for. So in this instance, if we went to contusostore.com/items, then this is the component that the router would load. But interestingly, the router doesn't know anything about the page directive. And that's because, you may or may not know this, but let me just untie my tongue there. Blazor components get compiled into classes. So while we write this nice Razor markup that makes our lives really easy as developers, that's there purely as syntactic sugar to make our lives easier. It doesn't help one iota for the actual application. The compiler is going to do away with all of that, and it's going to convert it into a much more computer-friendly class. So this particular one will end up looking something like this. And the key part to notice here is that this page directive gets compiled into a route attribute. And you can see that the route template also gets compiled into that route attribute as well. And that's the thing that Blazor's router looks for, is that route attribute. So there's actually two checks it has. It actually wants to make sure, firstly, that the class is inheriting from, I've got component base on here, but I have a funny feeling it's not component base. I have a funny feeling it's iComponent, which is the interface that component base adheres to. So that might be wrong. But anyway, it has to inherit from either iComponent base or component base. And it also has to have this route attribute on it. And basically, if those two things are there, then that's going to consider that a page component. It's going to record some information about it. It's going to record it in something called a route entry. So what it's going to do is take that meta information over there, and it's going to pull it over, and it's going to put it into a route entry. So there's going to be a template, which is obviously the root template that I mentioned a second ago. And then there's going to be something called a handler, and that's just the type of the component. Okay, so it's the type of that page component. So in this instance, it's a component called view items. Now, it does store some other bits and bobs on here, but they're sort of very, very nitty-gritty details that you don't really need to care about. It's just for people like me who go wading through source code. But yeah, so that's the key points that you really need to understand about how the router finds page components. So how does the router actually understand the navigation events? How does it intercept them? Well, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to walk the path from an actual link click happening all the way through what happens in the JavaScript side of Blazor, and then the crossover to C# and into the router, because the router lives in the C# side, doesn't live in JavaScript. And there's a hell of a lot of stuff happens in JavaScript before we get to C#. And this applies to both Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. So let's get going. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this normal anchor tag we've got here. I've used this one from earlier, an earlier slide. So the first thing that happens is the event hits Blazor's event delegator. Now, Blazor has an event delegator, and essentially what it does is create an artificial bubbling process for lots and lots of different events. So it's kind of like a layer on top of the JavaScript eventing system, and it allows Blazor to handle all the different types of events that happen in the DOM. It does have a special use case, however, for navigation events. So there's a navigation manager that lives in JavaScript. This is a JavaScript version. Okay, you might have heard of a navigation manager before, but that's a C# version, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. Now, the navigation manager actually registers a callback with the event delegator. So whenever the event delegator intercepts a navigation event, it triggers this callback, okay? And that calls back into the navigation manager. And the navigation manager is then going to do some things with this event. It's going to run a load of checks initially to make sure that it's something that it should actually deal with. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to check to see if interception has been enabled. So this is an internal switch. It's turned on by Blazor's router. So when Blazor's router initializes, it does some interop and turns on this interception. And basically what it's there for is to let the navigation manager that sits in JavaScript know that the route is available upstream to handle any navigation events. Because if that hasn't happened, if the router has crashed for some reason, if, I don't know, we forgot to include the router component, then the navigation manager shouldn't deal with the event, because there's nothing further upstream to handle it. It will just get sort of pushed down a pipe and it will get lost in the internets. So after it's done that, the next thing it's going to do is check if any modifier keys were pressed. So if the user was holding Shift or something like that when you click the link to open it in a new tab or a new window, then again, we're not going to intercept that. That needs to happen. The user's made a deliberate choice there to move to a different browser window or a different browser tab. So it needs to be executed as normal. It will also check for the presence of a target attribute. So on an anchor tag, you can put an attribute called target, and that has lots of different values. But essentially, the majority of them do the same thing. They just open it in a new tab or a new window, depending on what's set up. And again, it's kind of a programmatic way of specifying that a link should open in a new window or a new tab. There is one caveat to that, however. There's a value for target, which is called _self, and that effectively means open where you are. So if _self, if there's a target attribute and its value is _self, then the check will still pass, okay? But if it's any other value, then it will fail and the navigation manager won't handle it. And then the final check that it does is a check for the base URI, okay? And to check that the route that we're trying to go to is within the scope of that base URI. So what's the base URI? Well, the base URI sits in the head tag of either the index.html if you're talking Blazor WebAssembly, or it's in the _host CSHTML on a Blazor server app. And it's this tag right here. And it's really important that it exists, because basically the router uses it to understand what routes it should and shouldn't handle. So in this instance, the Blazor application is running as the root application of the domain. So let's pretend this is our Contuso store again. The Contuso store domain is a Blazor app, okay? So it's the root application. So hence it's just a /. Now what's actually going to happen here is that value in href is going to get applied to any relative links on your application. So for example, the two links below here to the CSS, okay, so the Bootstrap CSS and the site CSS, they're both relative links because they don't start with a /. However, what's going to happen now is that at runtime, the browser will add the value of the href on the base tag to any of these relative links. For these CSS things, it doesn't really matter as much, but say you have links in your Blazor application, it will matter. So if you don't start them with a /, they will get prepended with whatever the value of that href tag is. So, for example, if we had contusostore.com that was some other application, okay, the root application was, I don't know, a Razor Pages app, for example, and then we had a sub app running at the /Blazor subdirectory. We don't want the router to handle any link that doesn't start with Blazor. So you can see here the base tag has its href value set to /Blazor, and it's important that that has a / at the start and at the end. Okay, you do need both. You need to top and tail it. Now what's going to happen is during that scope check by the navigation manager in JavaScript, it will look at the value of that base tag. And if that link doesn't start with Blazor, it won't handle it. So for example, if we go back to our link that we started with at the top there, items/2, that wouldn't fall within this, okay? Because it starts with a /, goes to items. That would see that as a deliberate act to move away from the Blazor application at that point. So hopefully that makes sense. And if that doesn't, please ask questions and I will explain it in more detail. So if all of these checks, or if any of these checks fail, then as I mentioned, the event's going to continue as normal, okay? So it's going to carry on bubbling through the JavaScript event system and Blazor is not going to interrupt it in any way, shape or form. However, if all of these checks pass, then two things happen. The browser history is updated and the address bar is changed. So those two things are what gives you that feeling of navigation, okay? So updating the browser history gives you the functionality on the back and forward buttons on the browser. And obviously the address bar gives you a visual indicator that the page has changed and allows you to bookmark it and stuff like that. The next thing that happens is a callback is invoked, okay? So there's a function in the JavaScript side of things called notify location changed. And that has a callback registered with it. That happens when the Blazor application boots up. Now, if it's a Blazor server app, that's registered, that callback actually goes over Signal R and goes back to the server and sort of transitions into C# via the Signal R hub. If you're in WebAssembly, then it's using straight JS interop to jump over the divide. And that takes us over to the navigation manager. And this is the one you would have heard of. This is the one that you would use in your Blazor components. So what happens here is in the navigation manager in C#, the URI property on the navigation manager is updated with the new value. So this new route we're moving to. And it also then raises the location changed event. Now you can subscribe to location change yourself. That's a public event on the navigation manager and you can listen for navigation events yourself and do stuff based on that. But one of the key consumers of that event is Blazor's router component. So the router listens to these navigation changed events, and then what it does is it reads the URI property of the navigation manager, and then it checks that routing table. And then two things happen. It either finds the component and we hit that found template and load up the page, or we hit the not found template and we render whatever's in there. Now, a key thing, oh, go on.
Just a quick one, just while you're at this stage, Andrew Wilkin is just asking, is this why when typing in /items /2, for example, in the address bar, the app reloads? Yeah.
So when you do that and you hit enter, what you're effectively doing is a full page refresh. So from a Blazor app perspective, you're doing a full reload. So you're crashing the current instance and restarting it. So that's why when you do it manually in the address bar, you do get a full page refresh. One thing I was going to highlight while I'm here, because I see a lot of questions and I've had a lot of questions from people saying about navigation interception. So if you're coming from JavaScript frameworks like Angular, there's a notion of guards in Angular where you can say, actually, before you navigate to this route, excuse me, I want you to perform some logic and check that you're allowed to, for example. How can I do that in Blazor? Well, the answer is right now you can't. The key thing to understand here is you'll notice as we leave the JavaScript side of things, is you'll notice that all of the eventing is in past tense. It's already happened, okay? The browser's history has been updated. The address bar has already been changed. So from the browser's perspective, we've already moved. When it gets into C#, it's already happened in the browser world. It's just going through the formality of loading the correct component in the router. If you want to do that kind of stuff, you kind of end up having to do odd things like listen for the location changed event and then do redirects afterwards, which then kind of, if you get it wrong, you can end up in a loop because you just redirect in location changed over and over again. So it's a bit of a weird one, but it doesn't quite work the same way in Blazor as it does in those other as it does in those other frameworks. So yeah, so I just thought I'd highlight that while we're here. Cool. So that's the journey of the actual event, the link, click, navigation, interception stuff. So let's talk about actual route matching now and how that routing table works. So basically, when we navigate to a particular route in an app, quite a few things happen really. So let's take this route, for example. So we're carrying on with our Contuso store, and we're going to go to this route of tech/cameras. So what the router does, it actually breaks this down. So it takes that route and it splits it on the slashes, and it breaks it down into these what are called segments. So this particular route breaks down into two segments, tech and cameras. And then what it does, it compares those against what it's got in its routing table. So if we go and look at a route entry, as I mentioned earlier, it records the handler and the route template, but actually it doesn't record it the way I kind of insinuated earlier. It doesn't record it as that full string. What it actually does is break it down into segments as well. So you actually end up with this template with however many segments there are in it. So in this particular route entry, we have a component called camera list, and that has a template called that's defined as tech/cameras. So what's going to happen here is, first of all, the router does a really basic check. It checks to see if the number of segments in the route entry and the requested route are equal. So in this instance, there's two in tech and cameras, there's two in tech and cameras in the template. Therefore, it's a match. So that's pretty straightforward. The next thing it does is segment by segment match. And this is just a straight up string match, okay? Because all routing segments are strings. So it's literally comparing the raw text of tech and tech. So they're a match, and same with cameras and cameras. So that's a match as well. So in this instance, the segment match would complete, and you'd get a route match here. And at this point, we would fall into that found template, and that route view component would now be getting that information about this camera list component in order to render it for us. So that's a real simplistic version, okay? So this is just nothing complex going on here. But I mentioned earlier about route parameters. So how do they work? Well, route parameters are a way of passing information in the URI. So in this instance, we've got this route of item/2, but two here is actually a route parameter, okay? It's like an ID of an item that we want to render. So this requested route gets broken down into the two segments just as it did before. And then again, we have a route entry. And this time we have a component called view item, and it has a template of /item/squiggly brackets ID. Now, you recall I mentioned earlier, this is how we define a route parameter, okay? So this has this setup here. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this will break down into two segments. So what happens this time round? Well, same thing as before, it does a segment count match. So again, we've got two segments in both sides. So that's a match, so we're good there. And then again, it does this segment match as it did before. So as I mentioned, this is string matching. So first off, here we've got items and items. Well, that matches, so that's all good. But this next section, we can't do a string match because we have this parameter, okay? And this is one of the kind of extra bits of information that's kept in the route entry that I kind of said you didn't need to worry about too much earlier on. And you still really don't. All you need to know is that when a segment is a route parameter, Blazor kind of puts a little flag to let itself know that this is a parameter and not a string literal. So what's actually going to happen here is there's going to be no comparison at all. what Blazor is going to do is take the value of the second segment from the requested route, which is 2, and it's just going to stuff it into that parameter. Okay, and it's not going to do anything else. So actually, this would just match at this point. At this point, this would be a route match, and then it's going to try and load that view item route entry. Now, there's a very easy pitfall to make here. All route parameters by default are considered strings by the router. So let's talk about route constraints. We're going to use the same route we did a second ago. Okay, so that breaks down the same way, except this time, my view item component has an ID, this ID route parameter, okay, and that actually maps to a parameter on the component, and that's going to have a type. Now, my particular view item component, I actually want that type to be a GUID. So what's going to happen now? Well, if I don't use this funky syntax of this ID colon GUID, it's going to treat it as a string. And a string obviously is not going to get cast to a GUID. We're going to get a cast exception. So what will happen? Well, we're going to do a segment match like we did before. That passes, and then we get to this, segment count. Now we do the segment match. So we know that works. What's going to happen now is that Blazor's router is going to try and cast 2 to a GUID. That's going to then fail, because obviously 2 cannot be a GUID. And it's not going to throw any weird exceptions at that point. Blazor is just going to go, okay, cool, that doesn't match. That's fine. It's not a segment match. In which case, it's then going to move on to the next item, or the next route entry in its routing table. So this route would not match at this point, and it would try and go and find another component. So route constraints are really, really important things to have, and I'll show you a demo of this in some code as well in a little bit. So the last thing we're going to talk about to you while we're in slides before I go into demos is authenticated routes and how they're handled. So this is a setup for a normal page component. We've seen this quite a few times already in some slides. So what do you have to do to say that, well, you can only come to this page if you're authenticated? You know, so let's pretend this is in an admin area or something like that. You know, you can only view items if you're logged in. Well, you kind of do exactly the same thing you do if you were using a web API. You just add an attribute called authorize, and you do that using Blazor's attribute directive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is all syntactic sugar. The compiler does stuff here to make it into something that's more understandable by Blazor. It compiles it down to a component which will look class, that will look like this. And actually, it just applies the same authorize attribute that you get in a web API. And it just decorates that class the same as the root attribute does. And it behaves in exactly the same way. You can even do stuff like this. So you can quite happily apply roles. So you can say you can only view items if you're in the role of admin. Same with policy. So you can say policy admin is admin or something like that. And again, you can see that just compiles down to an authorized attribute with roles the same as it would in web API. Now, in order to make this work, you actually have to make some changes to Blazor's router. So the route view component by default doesn't understand authenticated routes. So it doesn't have any clue what that authorized attribute means. So what we need to do is we need to take this particular component, we need to swap it out for another one called authorized route view. So this is actually derived from a route view component, but it's got some extra secret sauce in it, which allows it to understand how the authorized attribute works. So basically, when you use this particular component, you get access to a couple of extra templates. So you can specify what to show if a user is not authorized to view a particular page. You can also specify something to show while the component is actually authorizing. So this doesn't really make any sense in Blazor Server because, to be honest with you, it's so quick there, you won't ever see this. But in Blazor WebAssembly, if you're going back and forth between, like, I don't know, Azure B2C or something like that, you will get a pause and you will see this message. So it's more useful there. So basically what happens under the hood with the authorized route view is it gets an instance of the authentication state provider, and it just simply goes, are you authenticated or not? Are you authorized or not? If you are, then it loads the page component. And if you're not, then you get the not found template. It's not any more complicated than that. Under the hood, what the route view, the authorized route view actually renders itself is an authorized view. Now, you might have used this yourself. This is the component you would use to sort of show certain piece of information to authorized users on a page. So you'd normally use this within a page. So you might use this to show a couple of extra menu options to authorized users or something like that. How the authorized route view uses it is like this. So it basically uses the authorized template and renders the page component if you're authorized, and it sort of copies over whatever you put in it's not authorized and authorizing templates and passes them over to the equivalent on the authorized view. So it's actually just using the same component you can use under the hood. And that's, yeah, that's all it is to it. It does create an interesting hierarchy though. And I'm not really sure if this is particularly informative or not, but I got you know, a bit excited with PowerPoint. So the actual cascade of components works out like this. You have the root component that has a found template that contains an authorized root view component that contains, that renders an authorized view component that will then render an authorizing template until it either renders a page component or a not found template. Yeah, I don't know if that's particularly interesting or not, but as I was sort of looking through all this stuff, I realized that was actually everything that's needed in order to render an authorized page, which is quite a few layers.
Chris,
so, yeah.
it looks really good, and I think it's definitely something that people will come back to when, you know, the need arises to kind of fully understand both from the authorization perspective and from kind of general flow. We've got just a couple of questions related to the routing. The first one was with regard to the handling. Is that the component itself? It was a question from Harsha. I'll just pop that up on screen.
Let me just jump back a couple of slides and not go to a demo. So I just want to check that I'm thinking of the right thing here. Go back. Are we talking about this bit here? This handler here? Is that the right one?
Yep, we've got exactly. We got a yes on that.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so that's actually the type of the component. So it stores it as a type information, but yes, it's going to create an instance of that type to display.
Excellent, super. And Andrew has another question regarding the multiple routes. I guess this is talking about the page attribute again, having possibly multiple page attributes. He's saying, is there a way to make a page match multiple routes like you can in Razor Pages? Additionally, do you know if there are any plans to add multiple parameters to the route?
I will answer that in a second because that's otherwise it's going to ruin my demo. Spoiler alert.
Okay,
yeah, just hold on for that one, Andrew. Literally, my next, as you probably noticed from my overzealous clicking, lovely transition. Demos. Everyone loves demos. Nobody likes PowerPoint. So let me just jump out of that because that's boring. Let's go and fire up Visual Studio. Now, you are all honored because I'm using this new preview mode for Visual Studio, which allows me to set it up specifically just for doing talks. So I'd love to know if this is easy enough to view because I've bumped up the font sizes of all like these Explorer windows and stuff like that, specifically for doing demos for talks and stuff. So hopefully, is that readable by everybody? Is that like coming through really clear? Yeah.
looks great.
Excellent stuff. Brilliant. Right. Let me just spin this up then before I go any further because that will just make life a bit easier. So, bog standard Blazor server app right here. We all know and love it. We can click it. It's brilliant. Everyone's seen a counter. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about is dealing with page components that aren't in the actual application itself. So, nearly everybody runs their page components in the same way. They have a Blazor application, WebAssembly server, whatever, and then they'll have a folder, or hopefully not a pages folder, hopefully a features folder, because they're so much better than doing things by type. Not that I'm biased, but never do this. This is terrible. But yeah, you'll have these. This has got all your page components. Okay, we've got our page stuff at the top here and everything. So that's great, but what happens if you're at a company where you have common pages between different applications? You want to reuse them. Well, one of the great things about Blazor is the ability to put components in Razor class libraries and share them around and stuff like that. Well, you can do the same thing with page components. You can put those in Razor class libraries. So I've got this component 1.razor here, so I'm not going to be overly imaginative about changing any of it. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stick a page directive on it. Oh, and I'm swapping between Windows and Mac, so my keyboard's all over the place. I'm just going to give this a root of RCL for Razor class library, okay, because I'm that imaginative. So we've now got a page component sitting in this Razor class library. So how can we access that? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the app component houses Blazor's router. Is that big enough as well, code-wise, for everyone to see? Okay, nodding heads, good. So I mentioned earlier, the router has this parameter called app assembly, and we can specify the assembly that it needs to scan to find page components. But it also has another one called additional assemblies. And what this can do is allow us to specify all manner of different assemblies for it to go off and scan. We can put as many as we want. So what it does is it just takes an array of assemblies. So we can follow the same sort of logic as we've got on the other side. So if I go like Razor class library dot component 1, and I can just do .assembly like that. That's now going to go and scan the assembly that this component 1 sits in. It's going to add whatever it finds component-wise into that that routing table that it holds. So in order to make this a little bit easier to kind of click around on, I'm just going to add an item here to the menu. So we call this RCL as the link, and we'll call this RCL page. That will do. So we've got all that there. So if I just jump back over to the browser and refresh, we'll see a new link on the menu on the left-hand side. And hopefully when we click it, we'll see the output of that component from the Razor class library. So it's as simple as that. So you can put all of your reusable pages into a Razor class library, and then you can use the additional assembly parameter in order to tell the router how to scan and look and find those additional page components. Cool. So that was a fairly simple one. So let's get on to root parameters there. So we're going to play around with the counter page. So we just had a question a second ago from Andrew, didn't we, about multiple page directives. These are perfectly fine. You can do this. So you can duplicate these. They can't be the same because that's a bit pointless. But you can have multiples. And in fact, what we're going to do here is we're going to add an additional one, and we're going to say start and count. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a starting count for the counter instead of having to sort of click through. We can start at a certain number. So in order to do that, I do need a parameter. So you can see I've already got this one in here. So the name of the parameter down here needs to correspond to whatever you've called your root parameter, because whatever the value is in this segment of the root, Blazor is going to try and put it over here. Okay. So I've got starting count there. I've got my current count is already set to use starting count, and I've already got my increment count set to use starting count as well, just to save you watching me click around and type. So I'm going to hit save on that. Going to go back over to the app and hit refresh. Now, the great thing about using multiple routes is that, like in this instance, where we click on count and we haven't specified a starting count, everything continues as it did before. It starts at 0 and we can still click. That's absolutely fine. But the counter component now is going to respond to that other route template we provided. So now if I go 100, it's going to blow up. Okay, and that's because, as you can see here, we've got this unable to cast object from type string to type int32. And this is what I was telling you about root constraints earlier. So you can see here, the starting count has got no root constraint on it at all. Therefore, the root is going to treat it as a string. But obviously, starting count, we want to work with it as an integer value. Okay, so that's going to blow up. So all we need to do is just do :int like that. And that's going to tell Blazor that that needs to be an integer value. So we can swap back over and hit refresh. And we don't have to do anything else now. That now is going to match. So when this just clicks through, it's going to reload. And we get a starting count of 100. So we can now click this up from where it was before. That's absolutely fine. And we can change this now to our high content. So we can 56. go in there. Now we've got starting count at 56, but we can click on counter and we can go back to 0 and we can do that again. So you can see that we're using multiple route page parameter, the page directives there. That's absolutely fine. There's no problem. You can put 10 on there if you really want to. I probably wouldn't, but you can. There's no limit. As long as they don't obviously conflict with each other. That's the only real constraint you have around these. They can't conflict with each other. Obviously, if you create 2 page directives on 2 different pages that have the same template, again, you're going to have a problem because Blazor's route is. It's interesting, actually. I don't know what it'll do. I'm fairly certain it throws an exception, but it also might just do a first come, like first one it finds, it loads that. I can't remember off the top of my head. I did check that out once, but I can't remember now. But anyway, that's how we can use some route parameters. So another popular thing we're going to want to do when we're building Blazor applications is programmatic navigation. That's pretty key, really. I don't know many applications that won't use that in some way, shape, or form. So what we're going to do is I'm going to jump over to the index page, and what we're going to do is navigate from the index page to the counter page. I'll put a text box on here as well. We can set a starting count, hit navigate, and programmatically navigate over. Excuse me. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add in, we're going to inject the not a navigation exception. That would be really bad. We're going to inject navigation manager like so. Manager. There we go. And then in there, I'm going to plop in a load of code because I type really slowly. So what I've done here is I've just popped in a normal input element, and I'm just binding that to this starting count, which is just a private field I've got down here in the code block. And then on the button, I've got an on-click event, and this is now changed because that's now navigate to async, I think. Go away. Oh, no, it's not. It's because sorry. There we go. I've got a typo in my code snippets. So then we've got an on-click event, and I'm just calling the navigation manager's navigate to method. Okay, and in there we just specify the route that we want to navigate to, and I can put a variable in here. So I'm like say I'm passing in whatever the value is of starting count, this field down below, and that's basically all there is to it. So I can now refresh the application. So if we go over to the home page now, we've got our text box, so I can put 20 in there. I can hit go to counter, and you can see I'm now on the counter route. Got 20 at the top, and my current count is starting at 20, and I can increment. I can do that whatever I want to do. So that all works each time. So programmatic navigation is pretty simple. Just navigation manager.navigate to. Now, one thing that's also worth noting with the navigate to is it does also have an extra parameter. Now, most people don't often see this, but it has this thing called force reload. Okay, so by default, it's set to false. But if you set this to true on here, and we go back, I will show you what happens. You can probably guess from the well-named parameter. But if I put a value of 12 in here, there we go, and hit go to counter. Now you can't really see that. I couldn't really see that looking at my screen. You definitely wouldn't be able to see that over Zoom, but that's actually reloaded the whole app. So basically all it does is it forces a full page refresh. So this might be quite useful in certain situations where you deliberately want to reload your application for whatever reason. I think the Blazor error message does this. So on that, where you get that sort of lost connection on Blazor server and you hit the reload button, that does a force reload as well, but I don't know if it uses Navigation Manager to do that or not. So anyway, that's programmatic navigation with Navigation Manager. What was the next thing I was going to talk about? Changing page parameters. So yeah, this is another one that it seems to be a frequently asked question. It seems to come up quite a lot. I've got this, well, we've got the normal weather forecast page here, but I've made a slight adjustment. What I've done is I've added a link for each individual forecast to be able to view it in detail. You just view the same information, but only one weather forecast at a time, but smoke and mirrors. And what I've done here is I've set up a page directive here. I've got the forecast, I've got it taking the ID of the particular forecast we want to load, and I'm loading that from the weather forecast service that I'm injecting. And again, I've injected the navigation manager in here as well. I've then got the same table that's in the fetch data page, but just for a single weather forecast. And now I've got two buttons, and I'm using the navigation manager to programmatically navigate back and forward, okay, between IDs. So if I come on here with ID 3, I can go to 2 or 5. But ultimately, I'm sort of trying to reload the same page basically. So I've got my view forecast page. I'm just trying to change the ID. So I've got my uninitialized async, which goes off and gets my ID. Gets my weather forecast of the specific ID, and then displays it for me. So it's fairly standard stuff there. So if we reload again, and if I go to fetch data this time, you can see I've got all these links here. Now, I'll click on this middle one. So there you go. You can see it's loaded up the correct weather forecast number 3, and we've got all of its data here. But if I click forward and backwards, nothing's actually changing. So you can see if you look in the address bar up there, I'm now on weather forecast 4, 2, 1. In fact, I can go way past any weather forecast and it doesn't break. There's certainly not 17, 18 forecasts on this page, but nothing's happening. Now, I've seen this quite a lot and people have been very confused as to why nothing's happened here. And really it's down to the fact that this is a single page application and Blazor is only going to render diffs. So in this instance, we're not changing the actual page. We're not navigating to a different page. Even in Blazor's terms of a page, we're not moving to a different page. We're staying on exactly the same page and just changing the value of the parameter that we're passing into it. So Blazor's not doing any re-rendering here at all because nothing's actually changed. There's nothing for it to re-render. And the reason there's nothing for it to re-render is because we're only checking for new weather forecasts on initialized, which only runs the first time the component is initialized. So what we actually need to do is use the on-parameter set lifecycle method in this instance. So if you've got a page that takes components and loads the same information, but for different things, you need to use this instead. And that's all you need to change. So this is going to now fire this lifecycle method every single time a value coming to that parameter changes. So we just changed that lifecycle method. We go back over now. First of all, it's now not going to load because there's no weather forecast 18. But if I come back onto here and go for weather forecast 3 like we were on before, and I hit back, you can now see that the values are changing in line with their particular IDs. Okay, so like I say, it's one of those things that I think once you see it, it probably the penny drops, but I can definitely understand why that's confusing to people, especially if you're coming from an MVC or Razor Pages background. That probably looks really odd. But yeah, it's just understanding the fact that unless there's something for Blazor to re-render, it's not going to update the UI. Lovely. So that was dealing with changing page parameters. Now, this is going to be fun. So this last one, I need to load up a new solution for this. This is kind of me just doing a bit of a hack around to see what I could get to work. I don't know if I've actually loaded it in here. No, I haven't. So let me go routing through my file system now. Where are we?
Chris, just a quick question regarding the multiple page routes. If we have defined multiple page routes, can you tell from the C# logic which route was actually called? So 2 might satisfy the router, but you might kind of want to know which one was called. Like, for example, a kind of Stripe payment for success or failure or something like that that calls back to the same component on different routes, but essentially is the same thing, and you'd like to know which one?
Yeah, so in that particular example I just showed with the counter, the way you would check is that is the value of starting count greater than 0? That would be how you do it. However, I will caveat that by saying that is not foolproof, because someone could pass a starting count of 0, and that would match the second route parameter, not the first one. The simple answer is really that if you need to know the difference, I would use separate pages, because there's no real way to tell, because unless you've got a value of something that can't be null, or something like that. So to use your Stripe payment example, if that's returning you a value that can only be either like this if it's come back from there, or if it hasn't, it won't have a value, then you could do it that way. But you have to be it's very specific to your logic. So it will very much depend on what that particular page is doing and how much you can rely on the value of those parameters to be one thing or another in the certain scenario.
Good answer. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Right. So I'm going to run this and see if this works, because I've been hacking away at this, and I'm fairly certain I've got it stable, but I just want to make sure it works. So if you've done MVC Razor pages, this probably looks really familiar. This is the starting template for MVC and Razor pages. And basically what I'm trying to show here is mixing Blazor into a Razor pages app. So I have a home page here. I have a privacy page. That's all Razor pages. And then I've got a counter, and that's a Blazor app. And then this is the fetch data page from the Blazor app. And I'm currently navigating using client-side navigation, jumping around between these two pages. But when I go over to privacy, I'm going back into the Razor page world. Okay. So how did this happen? I'm going to close all these down first, and then we'll go through it. Let me just lower that. So first of all, I've got a Razor class library here with all of the Blazor components in. Okay, so I've not got a Blazor server application or a Blazor WebAssembly app. I'm just serving these components out of a Razor class library. So in there, I've got the page components. I've got some data for the weather forecast, the main layout, some CSS for that particular page as well, and the main app component. So I basically got everything for a Blazor app minus the program CS and startup CS in this case, because this was a Blazor server app. In order to get this to work, I'm doing a few things. So first of all, you can see I've got all the various Razor pages in here. So what I need to do, first of all, was in the startup of the Razor pages application, first of all, I needed to register the services for server-side Blazor. So I've got that in there. I've turned on detail error messages. That was what I was troubleshooting. So I've registered that. I've also set up a couple of endpoints in here. So first of all, I've set up the Blazor hub, and very importantly, it's got this /Blazor at the start of it, and that's going to relate to that base URI we were talking about earlier on. And then I've got this map fallback to page, which is this /Blazor page here as well. So the Blazor page here is effectively the same as the underscore host CSHTML in a standard Blazor app, with one key difference. I've got that base href set to /Blazor. Okay, so that's basically saying that if as soon as we hit the /Blazor sub URI subfolder, everything within that is going to be a Blazor application file. Okay, anything that doesn't start with that, that's going to be Razor pages. So that's why I was saying earlier on, this is why it's, to be honest with you, I kind of hyped it. In all honesty, if you're using a root run Blazor WebAssembly or server app, it actually does work if you don't have the base tag in there, but it's just good practice to make sure it's always there. So yeah, anyway, that's set there. There's a couple of little bits you have to do. So for example, to load the CSS from that components Razor class library, that loads from the root of the actual application itself. So I need to actually put / on that to make sure it loads from the root. Otherwise, if I don't, that will be a relative URL. And like I mentioned earlier, that will get /Blazor appended to the front of it, which will not be great. I'm using the component tag helper to render the app component, same as you would in a Blazor server app. I've got the Blazor area UI like before. And again, I've got the reference to the Blazor server.js, but again, very key, I've got that / at the front to make sure that loads from the root of the application. So with those bits in place, the only other real thing I've done is I think it's the layout here. You can see that my links here have just got / Blazor on them to make to sort of trigger that fall into that Blazor root. and that's pretty much it. There's actually nothing more to it. And with those bits in place, you can jump around. The only thing you'll get is that little blip where you do get that little not found. That's the only bit I haven't quite ironed out yet. But yeah, depending on how your machine's doing that day, you can either see that or not see it, depending on, like I say, how fast it's feeling that particular day. So yeah, so that was the last bit I wanted to finish off really, and sort of see you can. This is kind of different to the, I think, blending of Blazor and Razor pages you would have seen previously, because that's usually around here's a Razor page and here's how you render a Blazor component within it, versus here's actually how you navigate from a Razor page to a Blazor page and back again. So a little slight difference there.
Chris, would we be talking about a large difference for a WebAssembly app, or is it exactly the same in terms of the way that you fall into /Blazor and everything would pretty much load from there?
So in theory, yes. I haven't got it to work though. What's really irritating with Blazor WebAssembly is that while I can get all of the initial stuff to work, when Blazor WebAssembly JS fires initially, what it does is it goes off to the server and downloads a file called blazorboot.json. And that's the file that contains all of the other files it needs to download. So that's all of your DLLs, it's the blazor.wasm or .NET.wasm runtime, stuff like that. And that's what's obviously loaded to then run your app. Blazor gets that blazorboot.json by using a relative URL, which means that it always gets prepended with whatever the value of the base URI is, which then means it doesn't find it because it needs to run off the base. I hope this is making sense. It needs to run off the root of the app, not off of the subfolder, and it blows up. And other than hard coding the change inside of that WebAssembly JS file, I haven't found a way around that yet, and it's really annoying. I feel I'm missing something really simple. I'm sure when this goes up on YouTube, someone will just go, "Oh, you just do this." But yeah, I haven't quite managed to get it to work. Just because of that. Other than that, if that worked and used the root properly, it would just work. The exact same as this does, really. The only difference is instead of doing map fallback to page, you do map fallback to file, and you would have to you'd probably have to add something like use Blazor static files or something, or whatever that middleware is. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but yeah, you do that and it would just load the index.html and then up it should all come. But yeah, haven't quite, like I say, I feel that's perfectly doable. I think I'm just missing something really obvious.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I think that would be quite a nice use case, wouldn't it, for actually integrating the two, where you've got that nice WebAssembly app kind of loading as a as a separate route.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing is as well, obviously all that stuff's getting cached as well, because when I was talking about this with someone a long time ago, like, oh, but then every time I change back and forth, I've got to re-download all those files. That's like 4 or 5 meg every time. Well, no, the first time it's going to download them, but you can jump back and forth as much as you want. That's just going to serve them from cache after that. So actually, it wouldn't. You pay the penalty once, and that would be it. So yeah, it would work fine.
Interestingly, we did have a question earlier in the week in the lead up to this presentation, Chris, regarding WebAssembly caching, and the term used was cache busting or cache bursting. With regards to publishing a new version of a WebAssembly app, let's take an Azure app service as a classic example. You republish the application. The comment was made that the cached version was being reloaded after publish. So the client was going back to the URI after the publish of the new WebAssembly version, same application, different version, newer version, but actually they were getting the previous cached version, which is most of the time great, until you actually go and update the app. Any thoughts on that, but WebAssembly specific?
Oh, caching in WebAssembly. So no, it's a nightmare. All of the files in Blazor WebAssembly are tagged with a GUID of a version, and they change every single time. So theoretically, it should bust cache every single time. I don't know if it's Blazor that's the problem or browsers being overly like cache like centric. It bugs me massively because as an open source author, my Blazor packages, every single time I do an update to a package that involves a CSS change, I get a slew of issues from people saying, oh, I've done this, it doesn't work. Okay, yeah, go clear your browser history. Oh, yeah, no, it's working now. Without fail. You can go back, look at Blazor mode, look at the closed issues every single time, at least 2 or 3. So that's only the people who have reported it as well. Aggressive caching is just a pain. The only way I've seen that it's really worked well is in Steve Sanderson's demo of PWAs, where he shows it getting a new version, and then there's a pop-up that comes up, say load new version, and he clicks that, and that does bust the cache, and it will load the new version of the app then. Outside of that, in theory, it should work with what it does now. It just seems to get stuck. And the problem is as well, it doesn't seem to be a consistent experience. So with my team at work, like we build apps, and like some of us would get a caching issue on certain changes and others wouldn't, and it wouldn't stay the same. So there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to it either. But yeah, I was just going to try and show you actually, because although it looks like when you run, oh, there we go. I've actually got some stuff up now. If I just quickly show you what I mean, I'll just quickly whiz through a new Blazor app. We'll go WebAssembly, we'll do this. And cool, let's run that. Tick, 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 come on. Lovely. So, let's get some browser tools open here, let this load up. So we've got all of these files that are loaded down here. Okay, so they've all come through as you expect. Now, if you go into application and then it's like application cache or cache, that one. There you go. So this is how they're actually cached. And you can quite clearly see that all of them have got this extension on the end of them. And in theory, when one of those changes because of a server change, they'll get a new value on them.
Kind of an append version in the ASP.NET world, but with SHA.
Yeah. So just trying to find the actual app. So if we look at that one, so this Blazor app 75.dll. So this is the actual application DLL itself. So that's SHA 256, and then it's got a load of stuff, and it ends in NVW equals. Now, theoretically, this is where live theory is probably not a great idea to do. I'll duplicate that a bit, okay? I'll rebuild it. Now, theoretically, that should change, if I'm right. Hopefully, I'm not going to fall flat on my face on this one. Did you see those DLLs change? Actually saw a couple of extra ones come in and then the other ones pop out. So you can see here, still got Blazor app 75 DLL. You can see now it ends in WH/A equals. So the actual version number's changed. So by all rights, this should bust cache and it should reload, which obviously in this instance it has. I've now got 3 current counts. But for some reason, the same doesn't apply to other files at times. So whether it's as well just something to do with CSS, maybe it's that's one. That's a good point actually. All of these files are the Blazor framework files, C# DLLs, things like this. I do wonder if this is actually just a normal CSS caching issue, where people are just calling. So if we go here, for example, look at the head tag, you'll see that the app CSS is still called app CSS. There's no version appended to that. So if you change that version, if you change anything in that app CSS, that could stay cached because there's nothing to tell the browser that that's changed. So actually, I wonder whether the cache busting is less to do with the actual Blazor files themselves more to do with the style and the JavaScript files around them. Looking at it now, that's just a massive penny drop for me. So I've realised that's why the style changes don't change for Blazor Modal. I need to append a version number onto my CSS. But anyway, that's my problem. But yeah. But I wonder if that's the case. I wonder if it's more CSS style caching that's the problem rather than app. I'd say if there's an app, if your app changes aren't going through, I'd talk to the Blazor team. I'd raise an issue because that shouldn't happen at all.
Yeah, I guess the nice thing with the WebAssembly app is that if it's published somewhere, they could go take a look, couldn't they? You know,
yeah.
and possibly.
I mean, based on our very quick experiment there, you know, that version, you know, that what's their version number on those DLLs and stuff, that is changing. So that's busting cache as I'd expect it to. Like I say, I wonder how many of these things are more style-based issues rather than, like I say, app-based issues. But obviously that depends on the scenario. But like I say, if the app isn't changing, I'd probably raise an issue and ask. It might just be something you need to do configuration-wise on the particular server. Don't know, but yeah.
Well, excellent. Thanks, Chris. That was really interesting. An interesting comment from Alex in the chat is perhaps Azure Cache the assembly restarting the app service may help.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
If you've got a CDN in front, for example, that might be an issue. So if you've got Cloudflare in front of it, Azure CDN, something like that, that'll take a while to propagate the change through. So, or they can take a while to propagate the change through. I think it's probably fair to say. So that could be another problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the problem was actually occurring from the comments deving locally. So I think it's more, you know, that potentially is a pointer worth exploring. Definitely. Thanks for that, Alex. Excellent. I think it must be time for the Wheel of Doom in terms of a giveaway. Are you okay for me to take control there, Chris?
Yeah, so I'll stop sharing. So.
And just incidentally, we are recording the session, and if you'd like to just check out the YouTube channel, it's a new channel that we just basically put together for these Blazor presentations, and it's just on the bottom of the site if you want to go check that out. And we will have John Hilton's presentation up there tomorrow, and then this presentation with Chris will make it probably within the next week or so, because we're on the kind of post-production now. So without further ado, hand over to you, George, for our first giveaway for our Blazor stickers.
Yeah, absolutely. Very exciting. Let's get this all started. Bear with me 1 second. So we've got 2 ones to give away today. Got first of all the Amazon gift vouchers, which is courtesy of Syncfusion. So a massive thank you to those. I can see you're all shaking with excitement once again.
Is it spinning?
So I will now click spin and see who gets them. And if it lands on the Syncfusion, that will be incredibly unlucky. Fantastic. I'm going to attempt to pronounce your name, and I apologize if I get it wrong. But Milir Erkan, I'll message you privately and get your details all sorted out to get those sent across to you for those Amazon gift vouchers. And now we do have one more spin available for the stickers. You want to do the stickers now, or are you going to wait for a bit to do those later?
I think it's probably quite a good time.
Yeah, we'll jump in. We'll just go straight in and spin again for the stickers. Fantastic. So massive congratulations to you then for that one. So we'll get the stickers out to you as well. If you guys just hold back at the end, I'll grab some details from you and we can get that all pinned across to you. And then, fantastic. So that's everything done. I'll pass back to you.
Lovely. Thank you, George. Okay, cool. So we do have an opportunity for a few more questions. Congratulations to those winners. If there's anything that you'd like to recap on, now is a really good time. And again, I think with the recording of this particular session, some sessions you can pretty much, do one pass on and it just everything sticks. But I think with this one, it is something that will be valuable to kind of go over a couple of times on, especially when you're kind of in the trenches with this stuff. So, thanks so much, Chris, for, a really detailed synopsis, starting with the JavaScript navigation manager. Again, we always think of the C# one, really interesting there with the scope checks, and how that kind of compares, the route matching with the segments, and also the Razor component libraries, utilizing those in a slightly different way for some of those shared components as well. Really, really interesting. The change of the page parameters, and then not to forget the on parameter set async for those scenarios where you want to kind of handle those lifecycle events a bit more aggressively.
Cool. Yeah, glad you liked it. There's always more to take in, Andrew. Always more to take in.
Yeah, so Richard's just asking, is it okay for some questions, not specifically routing? And I think that'd be okay for a few minutes, Richard.
Absolutely, yeah.
What I'll do is I'll just take off the muting, unmuting for you guys, so you can say hi. Thanks, Andrew. Lovely to have you here.
Thanks for coming, Andrew.
There we go, guys. You can all unmute yourselves now, one at a time, please.
Hey there.
Hey.
Hi, Richard.
So the question I was just going to, I was just curious about as you were going through it, because I'm kind of new to Blazor, done a lot of Razor stuff in the past, and recently been doing a lot of Angular front ends. Is when you're in Blazor, what have you got in terms of testing frameworks? So in Angular, you've got Jasmine tests and protractor tests, but what do you have when you come to Blazor?
So there's nothing official from the team, like from Microsoft. There's a brilliant open source library being developed by a community member called Eagle Hansen, called BUnit. Excuse me. It's good to the point that the Blazor team aren't going to build one. They're going to back him. So he's going through the process at the moment of improving the library and getting it into the .NET Foundation. And that will be the official testing library of Blazor. It's a brilliant library. Eagle's, like, the way he's thought about doing it is fantastic. So you can write pure C# unit tests for your Blazor components, but you can also write components for your Blazor, write unit tests for your Blazor components using Blazor components. So it's brilliant. So you can create, in fact, I can still share my screen actually, can't I? Let me just bring it up for you. Hold on 1 second. Because it's just a fantastic library. So can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So given, and I'll zoom this as well. So given the normal counter component that we're used to, you can build components like this. Build tests like this. So you can use this test context, you use a test renderer, you find a button and click it. And again, if you're coming from Angular and things like Jest and things, this is probably looking a bit familiar, that kind of style. And then you can check that the output matches what you expect. So in this instance, that the count is incremented to 1. So that's the kind of C# version of it. But then there's the Razor syntax for it. So with that, you use components to, as I say, test components. So you create a component for your test. It has a fixture. You can then render the component under test. And then in the code block, you can use that to set stuff up, do assertions, whatever you need to do. Really novel way of approaching this problem, using the technology you're testing as the thing to test it with. It's just brilliant. And the amount of work he's putting into this is phenomenal. This is where you want to go, basically, if you want to do unit testing of Blazor components. I'm really slow, but I'm getting it into all of my Blazor open source libraries. I use it currently for the modal and for the toast component, I think, as well. I'm trying to add more tests as well. I use this at work. It's great. So yeah.
Great. Cheers, man.
Sorry. I'll put the link in the chat as well.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Cool.
Thanks, Chris. Incidentally, coming up next month, we've been working on an application which should make it into production next month, which I did mention in the previous presentation, which is an application which is a camper van booking application. So it's got a front end and it's got a back end dashboard, both written in Blazor WebAssembly. And that's utilizing some of Chris's components as well, the modal dialogues and also the toast notifications as well. And quite interesting things that you can do, particularly with the Blazor modal dialogues, passing classes and components in and actually passing data back out as well. Really nice without actually having a pop-up. So it overcomes tons of problems. So if you'd like to see a little bit about that, then look out for the next meetup that we will arrange for hopefully next month. Super. Well, again, Chris, a massive thank you to you for these insights on routing, and we really look forward to having you back as soon as possible around your busy schedule.
Thanks for a great talk. Yeah, brilliant. Oh yeah, well, yeah. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't boring. So yeah. I was saying to Carl at the start of this, I do desperately need to come up with another round of talks and stuff, but it's trying to squeeze that in at the moment. So as soon as I have a new one or an idea for a new one, I'll bring it here. You can tell me whether it's worth pursuing or not.
Yeah, we'd appreciate that. We're kind of hands on the pump with the Blazor at the moment, and anything that you've got that might break, we don't mind. We'd be really, really appreciative of that. So, and I know everyone else would. So
I do have one more quick question.
Go on, Richard.
Oh, really briefly, sorry, and hopefully it don't mean too in depth. The DLLs that are coming across in your network traffic there, how much content have they actually got in them? Is it just the basics of what's in those pages?
It depends which ones. So they are the application. So they're not special in any way. So they're the same DLLs that run on any other .NET runtime. It just happens to be that this particular runtime is running on WebAssembly. So you could take those DLLs and run them on the full .NET Core runtime on the server. They would execute the same way. They're exactly the same. They're not modified in any way to work with WebAssembly. So I guess the answer to your question is that no, they're not. That they're fully fledged DLLs with everything in them they would be in them. What Blazor does do is has this notion of assembly shaking, tree shaking, effectively, but it only does that in production mode. So you need to publish your app for that to happen. It won't do it in development mode. It used to. You could just set the mode to publish and run it, and it would do it, but it won't. You need to do a full publish now in order for that to happen. That's a bit different. That will strip out any code that that your application isn't using. The thing, so to bring that back to your question, the thing that I'm not sure about though is whether it trims internals of what's in DLLs, or whether it just removes an entire DLL if you're not using that bit of the library. But if you use like one bit from that DLL, it includes the whole thing. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it will. But I mean, and it will effectively try and remove everything it possibly can that you're not using. And I know they're working on making that even more aggressive, to cut sizes even more. A lot of the problems, I think I'm right in saying with this, is that it's quite difficult to tell sometimes because of reflection what is and isn't being used. So I think they're trying to work out better ways of doing that. I think they're using I think I saw someone saying the other day about static code generation is being used to help work some of this stuff out for .NET 5 and what have you. But I don't know how that was rumor mill stuff. I think I saw it on Twitter, so I'm sure it's true. but yeah. So yeah, sorry, I can't really be 100% precise on that. But
no. It's more. I was just thinking in terms of the realms of considerations around security. When you've kind of got this one project that contains, your server side and your what's becoming your client side code as well. It's just you've kind of got. Do you have to kind of visualize that boundary a little bit better?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, in terms of security, it's a great point actually to bring up is that whatever you do, never ever trust the client. So if you download anything to that client, whether you encrypt it or not, like it doesn't matter. That's insecure. If it runs on a client machine, device, whatever, you can't trust it. So it's one of the reasons why there's an experimental package from the Blazor team as well, I think, called Protected Local Storage, where they encrypt data into local storage, which is quite good for obfuscation. I can't even say that. But I've seen some people going, oh, that's cool. Now I can save some passwords in there. No, you can't. Yeah. You can't, because someone will still work out how to decrypt it. Yeah, it's a really good point to bring up when it comes to DLLs. If you have a Blazor WebAssembly app and you include your backend business logic as a project reference, for example, that will get compiled and sent down as well to the browser. So then all of your business logic could be reverse engineered. So if you've got IP in there, that would be a problem. So you need to always think of Blazor WebAssembly the same way you think of Angular or Vue or any other front end framework. Keep it's client side. It's a separate project. Blazor Server is different. It doesn't download anything, so it doesn't matter. You can have. I mean, don't do this. I've mentioned this before, but you can directly inject the DB context into a component if you really want to, and do stuff, because it all executes on the server, so it's fine. You just get the output sent down to the client, but don't do that.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Please don't do that. But yeah, but you can do. So yeah, but don't do it with WebAssembly. Keep it separate. Treat it as a same as you would a JavaScript single page application.
Brilliant. Thanks for that.
Chris, just a quick one regarding Blazor WebAssembly versus Blazor Server. Obviously, WebAssembly was the one we were waiting for, and it almost felt initially as if Server was the kind of first implementation, and actually that the golden goose was going to be WebAssembly. But over time, can you see Blazor Server actually kind of coming back with a vengeance in terms of some of the problems that it solves, or can you see WebAssembly staying, or is it just a case-by-case basis?
So I'm going to fall back on the usual software developers idiom of it depends. It's really difficult because a friend of mine, Michael Washington, is a big fan of Blazor Server, like to the point that he's evangelical about a Blazor Server, and for good reason. It's a fantastic piece of technology, but it's like everything else. It's a tool in the toolbox. A lot of people dismiss Blazor Server because they think it won't scale and it won't be performant, even though all of the test data proves otherwise. But because you kind of can get it set in your head, you think, oh well, all this stuff's going back and forth all the time. That it just can't be performant. Well, actually, it does scale really quite well, and there isn't really a problem. What's interesting is there's a lot of talk now of people talking about how insecure SPA applications are, and the fact that really there's no way to make them secure. It's just calculated risk. And also that they're not particularly fast because, depending on how they're built and what's going on, they're very easy to get wrong, and they can, you can make them very bloated and you can do too much on the client. It's kind of one of those great power, great responsibility situations. Just because you could push it to the client and do everything there doesn't mean you should. I saw someone wants to use this library called JS Data, which is like a similar. The way I'd equate it is like entity framework for JavaScript, running in an Angular app, and it literally downloaded the entire object graph for every object in the database. Every time you wanted, if you got something at the bottom of the object graph, it downloaded the entire object graph along with everything else on it, just to load up that one record. And a page took 41 minutes to load because I sat there and watched it. 41 minutes, and that was a single page application. Like, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And a lot of talk has been about now doing server rendering for speed. Things like dev.to, for example. That site is lightning quick, and it's a server rendered site. Another site that's lightning quick, Stack Overflow. They render their homepage in 12 milliseconds. Like they were asked about Blazor, and they're like, well, we wouldn't touch it. It's too slow. Like they can't get that kind of performance. Maybe I don't know. Maybe they could with Blazor Server. I'm not sure, but with Blazor WebAssembly, they definitely couldn't. So I'm intrigued in terms of where the world goes, because there's kind of this rustling from the front end world about how server rendering is just better. It's faster, it's more secure, it's more scalable. Versus the other side of the fence where WebAssembly sits. And it's like, well, WebAssembly is this gateway to native performance in a browser. It's the end of native apps. We don't need them anymore. We can just run everything as a web page with high performance because of this fantastically efficient bytecode. And I don't know which way it's going to go. I don't even know if one will win out on. I think often in our profession there's too much emphasis put on the one way of doing something, when really there's always more than one way to do something. But we do like fads. We do like following trends. Microservice. Everything had to be a microservice at one point, and then people end up in a world of pain. So they've got 300 microservices they don't know how to manage. So yeah, I don't know. It's really difficult to understand. What I think I will close out this waffle with is Blazor Server is a viable option for quite a few types of project, and it shouldn't be ignored, because it I think sometimes gets made out to look like the poorer child, if you know what I mean. And it's really not. It's a fantastically powerful platform with some great use cases. And really, if you look at the evidence, I think I share it on one of my other talks from the Blazor team, on a relatively low powered Azure instance, it was supporting 5,000 active users. I mean, 5,000. And like I say, it's not just connections. These are simulated clicking, actual using it. I've never written an app that needed 5,000 simultaneous users to be supported. And in my circle, I haven't met anyone who's done that either. You know, that's some pretty impressive power that's a pretty impressive application to need to support 5,000 concurrent people. And if it can do that, how many situations, you know, like I say, warrant more power than that? But yeah, don't know. That wasn't a very direct answer. There's a lot of waffling. Sorry.
I think we appreciate the waffle, and I think from the look of those that are hanging on to hear some of the answers, I think we appreciate it. It's quite refreshing, actually, for you to say that, you know, A, it depends, and B, you know, it's just really down to kind of each scenario as to what kind of fits, and sometimes we need to be empowered to make those decisions in terms of the architecture for what's right in the application we're developing. And I think, yeah, it's really refreshing, and yeah, appreciated, Chris.
Yeah, no worries.
Cool. So we've got a few more thanks in the chat. One from Harsha just saying that the kind of migration, you know, converting to Razor pages is somewhat eased with the fact that you can combine the two, and that's a nice comment that has been added.
Yeah, that's why I've been trying to desperately get that working, because it's just such a nice way to migrate. If you're looking to fully migrate, it's a good way to do it, because you move everything into that Razor class library, and then one day all you need is to create a Blazor application. And the great thing is, at that point, you can have, once you've moved everything over to that Razor class library, it doesn't matter which type of Blazor you want to use. You can make the choice then. So if you've been using server-side Blazor up to that point, once everything's in Blazor, you can make the conscious choice to move over to WebAssembly, because you just put a WebAssembly project on the front of it, reference the Razor class library, and bang, now it's a WebAssembly library. Obviously, depending on your services and how they work, you know, API calls versus direct calls, all that kind of stuff. You need to abstract that properly. But other than that, you can swap it to whatever you want. So it does work well as a migration path.
Fantastic, Chris. You've definitely, from all the comments in the chat, everyone's, you know, thoroughly enjoyed this evening, and we really appreciate the efforts and the insights that you've passed on to us this evening. So with that, we would like to say thank you very much. And
thank you very much for having me, letting me waffle.
Well, if you're enjoying the content in our .NET Foundation user group, then please subscribe to the channel. Also, hit the bell icon to get notifications of when we upload new content. See you soon.